December 14, 1962. A spacecraft the size of a small car passes within about 21,000 miles of Venus. Its radiometers are on. Its transmitter is talking. Back on Earth, engineers are reading numbers off a planet nobody had ever measured up close, and by every reasonable reading of that spacecraft's own flight log, it should not have been alive to do it. One solar panel had already quit. A gyro circuit had failed. The onboard temperature had climbed past what the design assumed. It kept working. That's the file. And the file has a name almost nobody can say out loud. By the end of this, you'll be able to explain why the phrase everyone quotes, "Anything that can go wrong will go wrong," has an exact mirror image that engineers actually use. You'll know where that mirror came from. You'll know what the 1962 record documents about two spacecraft that had no business finishing their jobs. And you'll know why your brain files the failures and quietly throws away the saves. That last part is the interesting one, because it's not a story about luck. It's a story about what a memory does with evidence it has no use for. Here's the assumption, and it's a fair one. Most people hold it. The assumption is that complex machines fail, and that when one survives, it got lucky. That there was some margin nobody accounted for, some fluke of physics, some good day. The engineer shrugs and says we got away with it. That's the folk version of a save. Luck. And the reason it's so convincing is that failure has a paper trail. A failure gets an investigation board, a report, a number. Success just gets a mission log and a press conference. One of those is easy to point at later. The other isn't. So let's pin the record. The phrase Yprum's law is Murphy spelled backwards. Y-H-P-R-U-M. It's a joke construction, and it's used to mean roughly the reverse of Murphy. Things that shouldn't work sometimes do. It circulates in engineering and computing culture, often attached to systems that hold together for reasons nobody fully designed. The record does not settle who coined it or exactly when. There's no signed origin document the way there is with Murphy. That's worth stating plainly. But the case doesn't rest on who said it first. It rests on the flight data. And 1962 gave us two files that read like the same sentence, twice. File 1. Mariner 2. Launched August 27, 1962, on an Atlas Agena B headed for Venus. And the reason it existed at all is the file just before it. Mariner 1 launched 5 weeks earlier, went off course and was destroyed by range safety. So Mariner 2 flies as the backup to a mission that had already failed once. That's the starting condition, not confidence. A second attempt, built from spare hardware, on a launch window that wouldn't come back around for over a year. And then, in cruise, the spacecraft started shedding parts of itself. About a month into the cruise, one of the two solar panels stopped delivering full power. Partway through, it came back. Later, it quit again for good. So for a long stretch of the flight to Venus, Mariner 2 is running on one wing. That matters because power drives everything. The transmitter, the heaters, the science instruments. The spacecraft was also getting closer to the sun the whole way, which meant more heat, not less. A machine losing power while gaining heat is a machine on a schedule. Nobody knew how long that schedule was. And the panel wasn't the only thing going. There was a gyro problem in the attitude control system. There was a period where telemetry dropped and then returned on its own, unexplained. Internal temperatures ran above what the thermal design had assumed for that point in the trajectory. Any one of those on paper is a mission-ending line item. Read the list cold, with no ending attached, and you would write this spacecraft off. That's the honest reading. And this is the part that makes the file worth keeping, because the list is real, and the outcome is also real. On December 14th, Mariner 2 flew its encounter and returned data. What it measured changed the answer to a question people had been arguing about for decades. Ground-based astronomy couldn't see through Venus's cloud deck. Some serious people still entertained the idea of a temperate surface under there. Mariner 2's microwave and infrared radiometers scanned the planet during the flyby, and the data pointed to a surface far hotter than any habitable reading. It also found no measurable magnetic field of the kind Earth has. That's the first close-range measurement of another planet by a spacecraft, delivered by hardware running on one panel with a bad gyro. Now hold that, because File 2 is stranger. File 2. Telstar 1, launched July 10, 1962, the first commercial communications satellite built by Bell Telephone Laboratories and the machine that carried the first live television across the Atlantic. It worked. That's the headline. But the file underneath it is about a hazard nobody in that room had a full model of, because the hazard had been created on purpose. The day before Telstar launched, the United States detonated a high-altitude nuclear test called Starfish Prime over the Pacific. That test pumped charged particles into the Earth's radiation belts. Telstar then flew straight through them, over and over. Telstar's orbit took it through the belts several times a day. Its transistors were sitting in a radiation environment more intense than the design had accounted for, partly because of that test, and partly because the belts themselves were still poorly mapped. Bell's engineers had hardened the electronics as best the knowledge of the day allowed. That knowledge was incomplete, and the satellite still relayed live television, telephone calls, and fax between the United States and Europe through the summer and autumn of 1962. It worked in an environment that had gotten worse after it was designed. Then, in November, it started to fail. A command decoder transistor degraded and Telstar went out in November 1962. Ground engineers worked the problem and got it back in early January 1963, and it operated for a few more weeks before failing for good that February. So the honest summary is this. A satellite designed for one radiation environment, launched into a worse one, delivered the first transatlantic television broadcast, died and was then partially recovered from the ground. 2 spacecraft. 1 year. Both should have stopped, and both delivered the thing they were built for. Which brings us to the question the whole file exists to answer, because if you leave it at luck, you've explained nothing. So here's the mechanism. It has 2 halves, and the first half is design. Both machines carried redundancy and margin. Mariner 2's 2 solar panels weren't there because the mission needed 2. They were there because the mission needed the power one panel could still supply if the other went. That's not a fluke. That's a decision made years earlier by someone who assumed something would break. Redundancy means the failure happens and the mission doesn't. The failure is still real. It just stops being terminal. Second half of the mechanism. Margin. When you design a spacecraft, you don't build to the expected load. You build past it, because your model of the environment is a model, not the environment. Telstar's electronics were hardened for the radiation belts as understood in 1961 and 1962. The actual belts, after a nuclear test, were harsher. The hardening still bought months of operation. That's margin doing exactly what margin is for, absorbing the part of reality your model got wrong. So a survival isn't the absence of failure. It's failure being caught by something built earlier, by someone expecting it. So why does none of that ever feel like the rule? Why does Murphy feel true and Ypres feel like a joke? because of how the evidence reaches you. A failure produces documents. Mariner 1 has a range safety destruct and a review of what went wrong. That's a permanent artifact you can point at 60 years later. Mariner 2's saves produce nothing comparable. There's no board convened to investigate the panel that kept working. The redundancy that carried the mission never generates a headline, because from outside, nothing happened. If this kind of case file is your thing, subscribing keeps them coming. That asymmetry then feeds your memory. You recall the disasters because disasters were recorded, retold, and taught. You don't recall the saves because nobody wrote them down in the same way. So when you go looking for a pattern, the only pattern available is the failures. It looks like the world tilts toward things going wrong. What's actually tilted is the record you're sampling from. And that's why Murphy's Law reads as a complaint about fate rather than what it was for engineers. An instruction to assume the failure and build for it anyway. Now what the record does not settle. Aprum's Law has no documented author and no fixed first date. It's a piece of engineering folklore, and anyone telling you who invented it is going further than the sources go. Some accounts phrase it as, everything that can work will work. Others phrase it as, systems that shouldn't work sometimes do. Those are not the same claim, and the wording drifts depending on where you find it. I'm not going to pick one and present it as canonical. The name is real and in use. The provenance isn't settled. There's a second open item, and it's the more interesting one. Assigning credit for a save is genuinely hard. When Mariner 2 finished its encounter on one solar panel, was that redundancy working as intended, or margin absorbing more than it was rated for, or both at once? The flight data tells you what happened. It doesn't cleanly tell you which design decision did the carrying. Engineers argue that afterwards, and they argue it without a destruct report to anchor them. A failure hands you a cause. A success hands you a list of candidates, which is the whole point of the file. Murphy wasn't complaining about fate. He was telling engineers to assume the failure and design so it doesn't matter. Aprum is what that instruction looks like from the outside years later when the panel quits and the mission finishes anyway and nobody notices the save. The record only keeps the wreckage. The margin goes unrecorded. Next file, a machine that ran perfectly for years, and the moment somebody finally fixed it, it stopped.